Good afternoon, and welcome again. As I said last time, I'll repeat it. My name is Kamal Hathi. I'm the General Manager for the Power BI product. And we now are at the last part of the conference. And so for the closing keynote, we have a special treat. And what we have for you are the Freakonomics guys. How many of you know Freakonomics guys? Yeah, woo! All right. Don't forget that applause when they come out, OK? So there's Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt. And for more background, Stephen Dubner is an award-winning journalist and radio and TV personality. He hosts Freakonomics Radio. It's a podcast, and he maintains also, I guess, the popular blog, the Freakonomics blog. And I'm told it's been called the most readable economics blog in the universe. So in case you want to know about economics, go to the blog. And then Stephen Levitt is a tenured professor at the University of Chicago in the economics department. And in 2003, I'm told he was a recipient of the American Economic Association's John Bates Clark Medal. And I guess it's given to the country's best economists under the age of 40. So it's pretty impressive. Now, with that said, together, I guess, both the two Stephens are the co-authors of the Freakonomics book, which is the best-selling book, and that's why the Freakonomics guys. And so please join me and welcome Stephen Dubner, Stephen Levitt, to give us our last keynote. Come on, guys.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for having us. We are the Freakonomics guys. Question, pop quiz. Does anyone have any idea who's who, though? Who's Dubner Levitt? You have no idea, do you? All right. I'll help you out. Levitt, Dubner, which means Chicago, New York, economist, and I'm a writer. So I don't know how much you all know about writers. I know that's not your thing. But a writer, the kind of person who becomes a writer is basically someone who's unemployable, OK? So who has no actual skills, analytic or otherwise. So what you try to do is like a parasite or a barnacle. You try to find people who do have skills and attach yourself to them. So that's what I've done, I think, quite successfully, you would agree. So I know you're wondering, Dubner, how do you spend your day? Right? You were wondering. So, so I'll very briefly, before I turn things over to Levitt for a bit, we'll just kind of take turns for the next hour or so. I'll tell you how I spend my day. So I live in New York City, fine town, and I am both, as I said, unemployable and pretty lazy. So my writing office is about a block and a half from where I live. So I wake up, got a couple kids, got a dog, make some coffee, have some coffee, say hi to the kids, and then I make the trek, block and a half to the office, close the door, and that's usually about 7:30 a.m. by then. Make a little more coffee maybe, that's exciting. And then for the next about 11, 12 hours, I just sit there all day. Close the door, sit there. I read a little bit, I try to think a little, and if the reading and the thinking go okay, then I might have something to actually write about. But again, not very many marketable skills, so that doesn't always happen. So sometimes just a lot of sitting in there with the dog for 10 or 12 hours reading. Some days, however, are slightly more eventful. So recently, for instance, I was reading one of my favorite journals, the Journal of the Journal of Agricultural Economics, which I'm sure many of you read as well. So I like agricultural economics in part because I like economics, and also because I grew up on a little failed farm in upstate New York, just up in the boondocks in the middle of nowhere, upstate New York in Duanesburg. You know Duanesburg? You don't know Duanesburg? You know Middleburg, then? Don't know Middleburg. Schenectady. Right, all right. Outside, about a half hour outside of Schenectady, I grew up on this little failed farm, and it's really hard to grow food, really hard to raise animals. And so the fact that we've gotten to the point where we routinely feed 7 billion people every day, 3 meals a day on this planet is remarkable. It's a remarkable feat of agriculture and economics. So I like to read about that, looking for ideas, for stories, and so on. And one day, I'm reading my Journal of Agricultural Economics, and it's an article, it's a survey on the change in consumption of different meats over the past century in America. And basically, you know, pork used to be by far the #1 meat about 100 years ago, and then beef took over. Somewhere in there, mutton had a really good run. Mutton was very popular kind of between the wars. Does anyone know why mutton kind of went away? It's an interesting side story. I won't go into it. But basically, mutton went away in part because of the invention of nylon. So once nylon happened, there was an artificial substitute for wool. Mutton were basically old sheep that were raised for wool, and then when they got pretty old, they would finally kill them. And so mutton is just old lamb meat. But there was a lot of it because there were all these sheep being raised for their wool, but once nylon happened, mutton went away. So anyway, it went pork, and then mutton kind of around here, and then beef took over. And that was the story for like most of the 20th century. But then, the last like third of the 20th century and now, poultry made this huge move. And now poultry is the most popular meat in America, mostly, as we know, chicken and a lot turkey, okay? So I was reading this survey about, you know, how it happened and what it means for economics and what it means for the consumers and so on. And I came across just this literally one little number in half a sentence, and it was just incidental to it. But for whatever reason, it caught my eye. And if you're like me, sometimes you'll be reading something and one thing will catch your eye and you want to follow it more. Or maybe you'll hear a conversation and one tangent will catch your ear. And that's the way it was for me. And this number that caught my eye in this half a sentence said that during this big rise in poultry consumption, turkey breeding changed, so much so that now 99.9% of all turkeys bred for consumption in the United States are the result of artificial turkey insemination. I thought, first of all, I thought, yuck. Like, of all the jobs to not have, like somebody's actually got to be in there working with the turkeys. And by working with, you understand what I'm saying, right? And so I saw this, and like I said, my first response was yuck. My second thought, first of all, I had never once in my life thought about turkeys actually having sex. Maybe you have, I had not. And I grew up on a farm, and so I thought about it, and then you think, why are all of them not actually having sex? So, you know, when you see one number like that, one piece of data, one statistic, it means nothing in isolation, right? You need to compare it to things. So I went to look at the chicken breeding data, thinking that would be a pretty good comparison. And I look up the chicken breeding data, and as it turns out that the vast majority of chickens bred for consumption breed the natural way. They breed organically. They basically have some kind of sex, okay? But the turkeys don't. So again, I'm very curious about why. And second of all, it's kind of a justice issue now, because the turkeys, you know, why are the chickens getting to do it and the turkeys are not? So I figure I got to solve this. So I spent the rest of several days, I'll be honest with you, trying to find out, calling people, writing people, doing some more research. And to make a long story short, here's what happened, or here's why. The turkey breeding is essentially all about artificial insemination. In the old days, when turkey was not so popular, the main breed of turkey was this kind of scrawny bird, and also Americans really only ate turkeys around the holidays when you'd roast a whole bird. But then, as we all know, turkey became more popular. Americans in particular love turkey breast meat. Okay, sandwiches and so on. Where does, the white meat comes from the breast, and so the producers, this is just the way the economy works, they responded to that increased demand, and they began to not only raise more turkeys, but they began to breed turkeys with larger breasts, both the females and the males, okay? So in the old days, when you would go into the supermarket, there would just be this one version of the turkey with this kind of scrawny breast. But now, over the last like 30, 40 years, they're breeding that flat breast to have bigger and bigger and bigger breasts, so that today, when you go into the turkey farm, and there's like Tom turkey here, and here's like, you know, Jane, right? And in the old days, they would have come up and done whatever turkeys, they kissed and started to make it happen, whatever. Now, because the size of their breasts, the breasts are so large that they physically cannot get close enough to organically procreate, thus the need for turkey artificial insemination, okay? This is how I spend my days. I thought you'd be interested to know. So, as absurd as this story is, I would argue that it's pretty representative of Freakonomics in that it contains pretty much everything that we do, which is using some data to try to figure out the incentives that change behavior in some way, whether it's consumer behavior or turkey behavior. And so that's how I spend my day, and I think it's probably a good time for me to let Levitt tell you how he spends his day. So I'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you, Stephen. I do not share the same kind of fetish with turkey sex as Dubner, but
not a fetish, not a fetish.
But I would say, in some ways, what I do is probably worse. I convince crack gangs to share their financial data with me, and I try to catch cheating sumo wrestlers. And more recently, I was able to prove that there's one activity that's about 10 times more dangerous than drunk driving. And that turns out to be drunk walking. It turns out drunk walking is about the worst thing you can possibly do if survival is what you're after. But I didn't set out to be a freakonomist, a weird economist. I wanted to be a real economist. But it turns out that to be a real economist, there's one particular skill that you need. They did a survey of the academic economists. It was a multiple choice question, said, well, what's the most important trait for success in our field? Okay? And one of the choices, choice A, was a good understanding of the economy. Okay? Turns out exactly 2% of my colleagues thought that's what you needed to be good at economics, to actually understand the economy. Over 70% said that the most important thing was proficiency at math. Okay? And unfortunately, I have never been in my life accused of proficiency in math. I first realized how bad I was at math when I was in high school. I took a calculus class in my senior year of high school, and this is how bad I was. When I came back for my 15-year high school reunion, my math teacher was there, and he was in his mid-60s when he taught me, and in his early 80s, therefore, by the time of this reunion. And I walked up to him and said hello without introducing myself, and as I do with my own students when I run into them, when they find me, I had no idea who they were. But I never really liked the guy, and my hope was that I could make him feel uncomfortable by just introducing myself and seeing what happened. And just as I'd hoped, he looked at me completely blankly, stared at me for a few seconds, and then a big kind of smirk broke across his face. And I wondered what he was smirking about. And he said, wait a second. Did you get a 2 on the calculus AP exam? And I said, as a matter of fact, I did get a 2 on the calculus AP exam. He said, I taught for 35 years at this school, and that is the single lowest score of any student that I ever taught. I managed to prove that 2 is no fluke when I showed up at Harvard, where I had somehow been admitted, and they do a battery of tests in freshman week. And when the placement counselor sat me down, she described the different courses she thought I should take. And when it came to math, she said, I would recommend that you take a course called Math 1A. Okay? It was literally the lowest offering at Harvard. It was remedial math, high school math, all over again. And I was well aware I was not very good at math, and I thought that was probably a good suggestion. And I showed up for my very first lecture at Harvard, and I remember looking around the room, and I was crestfallen, okay? Because as I looked around the room, I couldn't believe that every other male, except for me, was like 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed like 215 pounds, and was incredibly good looking. I thought, how could this be possible? It was only later that I realized it was because the only people in Math 1A were me, the football team, and the hockey team. Everyone else had actually placed into real math. Okay? The good news is I smoked those guys. #1 in the class, best grade in all of Math 1A. But I was smart enough to know that even if I could beat the hockey team at math, there wasn't much hope that I was going to be able to compete with the other people at Harvard. And I had the good sense never to take another math course. Everything was going fine in my life, until one day I had this epiphany that I should go back and get an economics PhD, okay? Completely and blissfully unaware of how important math was in economics. I applied to schools, and almost beyond description, when I look back at it, inexplicably I was admitted to MIT's economics program, PhD. Okay, probably the most rigorous mathematical and statistical program on the planet in economics. Okay, again, still blissfully unaware of exactly how little I knew about math and how important it was. I showed up at MIT. Okay, and my confidence and my joy of being accepted to MIT lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes as the professor began to scribble equations up on the board. Okay, and in these equations, of course, there were some D's. Okay, and I remembered enough from Math 1A, which I had taken 7, 8 years earlier, to know that when there was a D in a math equation, it stood for a derivative. But there was something that was a little bit unnerving, because it almost seemed like the professor was making 2 different kinds of D's. Like there were these regular D's, and then it almost seemed like there was like a script D or something, you know, side by side with it. But I'd never seen a script D in an equation, and I just assumed it was bad penmanship on the part of the professor, and I just wrote down D, D, D without much concern. But the longer this lecture went on, the clearer it became, because these regular D's were always right on top of each other with the line in between, and then these other weird D's were always on top of each other with the line in between. Okay? And I thought for like maybe 1 second about raising my hand in my first day at MIT and saying, I'm sorry, I've never seen the D before. Could you please explain what it is? But I knew I couldn't do that. It'd be too embarrassing. But I also felt like I must be really missing something. And so I decided to take kind of a middle ground course of action. And I turned to the guy next to me, and I whispered, hey, Neil, is there a difference between the straight D and the curly D? And he turned back to me, and all he said was, you are in so much trouble. Oh man, was he right? Was I in so much trouble? Because it's probably all you know that curly D was a partial derivative. And they didn't get to that far in Math 1A. We didn't have anything about partial derivatives, and I'd never seen it. And it was just a precursor of the living nightmare I was going to have over the next semester. As lecture after lecture, I was bombarded with math I'd never seen before, and it was completely clear to me and to my peers and to the professors that I was completely and totally out of place. Okay? And the only thing that saved me was the fact that at MIT, they had a lot of rules and regulations regarding failing students. You had to do an extra, I don't know, hour or 2 of paperwork if you wanted to fail a student. And fortunately for me, all of my professors were economics professors who were self-interested and lazy, and each of them gave me a C- and hoped that the other professors would do the right thing and fail me out of the program, but none of them did. And that's how I made it to winter break, where I went back to Minnesota, where I was from, and I pondered my fate. I mean, it was obvious I had made a terrible mistake, right? I shouldn't have come into this program, and I was only going to fail. And indeed, if I knew what I knew now, I would have taken a different course of action. Actually, in many ways driven by a lot of the ideas that Stephen's had and some of my own experiences, I recently did a study where I started a website called freakonomicsexperiments.com. And at the website, I encouraged people who were having trouble making big decisions about their future, you know, whether they should quit their job, whether they should end a relationship, had them come. And ostensibly, the purpose was that we would ask them a bunch of questions, get them to think differently, think like an economist, and in that way, solve their problems. But the real goal, the hope was that they wouldn't be able to figure out their decision. They'd still be completely and totally torn. And if that were the case, we would do them the ultimate service. We would decide for them. Okay, we had a big, shiny virtual coin, and we would toss it in the air, and if it came up heads, they would quit. They would quit their job, quit their relationship. If it came up tails, they would stay in their relationship. Okay, and we asked them to agree to do this, and amazingly, about 25,000 people came and flipped our coins, and even more amazingly, people actually listened to the coin toss. So the people who got heads were much more likely to quit, about 20 to 25% more likely to quit than the people who got tails. And when we followed up about 6 months later, it turned out that the people who got heads were happier, self-reported being happier than the people who got tails. Okay, it was a randomization. The only difference between the people who got heads and tails was that the people who got heads tended to quit more. Okay, so from what I conclude then is that actually quitting is wonderful. Quitting is great. Quitting is a highly underrated activity. Okay, and if only I had known that back when I was in grad school, I would have done the right thing and I would have quit right then and there. Okay, and I imagine wonderful things might have come to me if I had quit at that time. Okay, but I didn't know enough. I wasn't smart enough to quit. So instead, I went to my parents and I told them about the quandary that I found myself in. And my father gave me the one and only inspirational speech I think he's ever given me in my life. So I got to, in order for the speech to make sense, I just got to tell you a little bit about my dad. He is a medical researcher. He's a doctor who, after he did his med school and internship and residency, he went and got a research fellowship. Okay, and that's the key moment in the trajectory of your career if you want to be an academic medical doctor doing research. Okay, and so my father had somehow managed to go from the small Midwestern kind of school to eventually being accepted into one of the most prestigious research fellowships in the country, with the man who was his mentor was going to be the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, so really at the pinnacle of academic success. So about 3 months into what was going great as far as my dad was concerned, now this is my dad's inspirational speech, and he swears to God it's true. About 3 months into his research fellowship, his mentor called him into the office. He sat my dad down, and he said the following to my dad. He said, "Levitt, I'm sorry to say, but you have no talent for medical research." You can imagine my dad's horror when he heard these words. Okay, but the guy kept on going. He said, "There is, however, one area of research which is so devoid of knowledge that even someone with your severe limitations might be able to make a difference." Okay? So my dad's spirits were buoyed a bit, and he said, "Well, what area is that?" And I kid you not, his mentor said, "Intestinal gas." Okay? Now, others might have taken these words differently, but my dad responded by taking the words to heart and devoting his entire adult life to the academic study of intestinal gas. He became the world's foremost medical expert on the topic. Okay? And he was rewarded with all sorts of prizes in his field, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and he even became a little bit of like a B-list celebrity, like GQ, for instance, the men's magazine. They did a 2-page pictorial spread on my dad, and the headline reads, "The King of Farts," they call my dad. Okay, now you got to remember, this is my dad telling me an inspirational story. Okay, so he tells me that story, and then he says, "Look, here's the point. I had no talent. You have no talent." If you want to succeed in a discipline for which you have no talent, the only hope you have is to take on a set of topics which are so embarrassing and degrading that no one with any self-respect will go near those topics. And I thought about it, and like my dad had done 30 years earlier, I thought, well, that's not such bad advice. Maybe I'll give it a try. And I went back to MIT, and I began studying the crazy, ridiculous topics that have since become Freakonomics. And in the end, I guess I have to thank my dad, because he got me doing stuff that no person with any self-respect would do, and it's worked out great for me. Now, one of the byproducts of Freakonomics is that suddenly we had a best-selling book, and in particular, it was called the best-selling business book. Now, God knows how it got to be labeled a business book. There's nothing about business in it, but it was. And when you write a best-selling business book, you immediately are a business guru. Okay, and that allows you to go and work with firms. And so I started a little consulting firm, and I have spent the last 10 years working with, I don't know, dozens of companies trying to do exactly what this conference is about, which is to create a data culture. Okay, and I have to say, honestly, I think I have failed in every single instance. This is a really hard thing to change culture. Okay, and I want to tell you a story that really gets, I think, at the heart of how hard it is to change cultures. So one of the first, perhaps the very first client we had, not the second client we had at my little consulting firm, was a retailer, a big, old, struggling retailer. And we cold called the CEO, and we told them who we were, and he said, "Yeah, I'd love you to come in and work with my company, figure out a topic you think where you could be valuable." So we just went talking to different people in the organization, and like Dubner said, that one fact that jumped out at him, as we talked to people in the organization, the thing that we found maybe more surprising than anything is it turned out that they had these people called buyers. Okay, and what happened was the buyers were the ones who were in charge of figuring out what was going to be in fashion, apparel-wise, like whether they should buy the yellow sweater or the blue sweater, the one with polka dots, the long skirt, the short skirt, okay? These people, that was half of their job, was knowing what would be in fashion. Believe it or not, the other half of their job was deciding how much they should charge for these, polka dot dresses, and not just how much they should charge when they start, but they were in charge of the dynamic optimization problem about how to change the price of these goods over time in order to make sure that they are off the shelves in 6 months, which was the life cycle of a product. Okay? So when they said this, all I could do was laugh out loud, because I thought of all the people I know who are good at solving dynamic optimization problems, and I thought about how each of them dressed, and I thought, how is it possible that the set of people who are going to know what's going to look good are also going to solve this problem? And I actually thought they must have misspoke. I said, you must have, that can't possibly be the same person doing both jobs. They said it was. And I said, with a lot of confidence, I really think, like, I don't know anything about polka dots, but I do think I know how to price better than the people who are doing this, okay? And in the end, it was a case that the CEO said, okay, we're going to give you a shot. And the buyers were so incensed at the fact that he had done this, and the fact that it was so clear they're going to lose so much money for the firm, that they insisted, okay, that it be done as a randomized experiment, which we thought was wonderful. We always like randomized experiments. And they insisted that every week we should write a memo which detailed just how badly we were beaten by existing buyers in order to make sure the CEO didn't get confused about the results of what happened. And so this firm had a lot of problems. I mean, their technology was awful. So when it turned out that the way that they got prices to their stores is they sent a weekly fax. Okay, and so so we got assigned a big, like half the stores. Okay, and in order, because we were going to charge different prices than the other stores, the only solution they could figure out was to send a double long fax to every store, and then the stores were either going to be in category 1 or category B, and they had to throw out half the sheets of paper that were the prices. So literally, they sent the prices that they put onto the racks through a fax, and the people had to sift through and throw out half of the stack because the company couldn't figure out any technology better for distributing the prices. It gives you a sense of where this company was. Okay? So what was the problem? It was actually, in some ways, an incredibly easy data problem, in the sense that there was a whole lot of data, and we got immediate feedback on that data. So we knew from past years roughly what the life cycle of sales of sweaters or parkas were over the seasons, and we knew that a big bunch of goods got dumped into each store on the first day of the season, and 6 months later, whatever was left was basically fire saled for like 10% of the retail cost. Okay? So the problem was, how do you figure out how to sell at the highest price over 6 months all of the stuff? Okay? And the answer is actually incredibly easy in the basic thinking of it, which is you figure out whether stuff is selling in the first few weeks, and if it's selling a lot, you keep the price really high, and if it's not selling, you lower the price. Okay? And each week you look and you see how much you've sold, and you try and figure out how much it's going to sell, and just make sure you end up with zero. Okay, it's a perfect problem for data, for an economist, and the only difficulty was that because the buyers wanted us to fail, they would only give us the data at 9 p.m. at night on a Tuesday, and they required us to put in our new price recommendations at 10 a.m. in the morning on the next Wednesday. So literally for 6 months, my team of workers had to stay up all night every Tuesday night crunching the data in order to get the prices out the next day. So the good news is that after about 2 or 3 weeks, we had assembled, we had built like a 3 or 4% lead already in terms of revenues. And the buyers were completely dismissive and said, yeah, that's just because you're selling all the good stuff off. You're going to get punished in the end. And in the end, we had built up near the final up to a 27% increased revenue. The same pile of junk we were selling for 27% more than the existing buyers had sold it for. And indeed, they were right. They did do some catch-up because when 6 months expired, they still had about 30% of all the goods that they had started with 6 months earlier were still in their stores, as opposed to about 5% of the goods for us. So they actually got like an extra 3 or 4% bump to make our final winning margin about 23%. Okay? It could not have been a more rousing victory for data, and we were really excited. We had shown the power of data and of thinking, economic thinking. And so when we sat down with the CEO and said, well, you know, we've shown we can do it in apparel, you know, we'd be happy to do it for all apparel now, you know, in all the stores, but we also, let's give us a shot at tires and you know, hardware and all the other stuff you sell. He said, well, you know, I know you guys did great, but the problem is you really hurt the feelings of the buyers. They're really damaged by the fact that you beat them by so much. So, so I've had to make some compromises, and it turns out in the next cycle, you're only going to get to price pajamas. I said, pajamas? And he said, yeah. I said, well, how many pajamas do you sell? And he told me the number of pajamas. I said, even if we increase the number of pajamas you sell by 5 times, it wouldn't even cover our fees. Don't you know how much we charge you? We charge you a lot of money. And he said, well, it's either pajamas or nothing. To which I said, well, then it's nothing, because I'm not going to have my team stay up all night pricing pajamas just for the sake of collecting fees from you. And it turned out that this was a case where, in the end, corporate culture and the need to make the right people happy led this CEO to abandon something which was probably worth something like 25% of the overall revenues of the firm. And I wish I could say that was an unusual occurrence, but I would actually say that was about average for us. We didn't always have that much success, but we always faced the same kind of obstacles to any kind of change. We always failed when it came to how to figure out how, you know, whatever the data, even if the answers were in the data, somehow the kinds of firms we worked with weren't ready for those answers, okay? So with that preamble, I want to give you a bunch of advice. So, you know, you got to weigh quite carefully the idea of whether you would want to take advice from someone who has failed so consistently and so dismally at doing exactly what the advice is aimed at doing. But my hope is that maybe you're in a better position to change cultures than we were. Okay, so I have a set of pieces of, I don't know, of what I think, for me, how I think one could possibly do the most difficult thing for data-oriented people to do, which is to actually change the culture. So the first is, and this is a little bit roundabout, not as head-on as some of the others, is that I think it's really important, if you are in the data business, to figure out how to dramatically reduce the marginal cost of producing data analysis. Okay, so let me give you an example. So actually, there's one company I worked with, and it's public, and I can talk about it, that was amazing with data, and that was King Games, the people who did Candy Crush. I mean, they were absolutely phenomenal, data-driven learning organization, okay? The thing was, the way they organized their data came out of the needs of I don't know, the consumer experience, the user experience. And so it was awful to do data analysis. Anytime we wanted to do anything with them, it took between 1 and 2 person weeks to deal with the enormous amounts of data they had and to reshape the data into a form you could actually analyze. Okay? And that was the standard thing. Whenever they did an analysis at King, it took a person week to do it. Okay? But the thing was, it drove me crazy. I didn't have the patience for that. And so what I said to my team was, can't you just, once and for all, take a big, you know, a chunk of the data and just reformat it so it's, in this case, so it's rectangular, so we actually can do what we're used to doing with it. And it took my team about, I don't know, probably took my team 5 person weeks of data to go ahead and build this enormous data set that pulled from all their sources and rearranged everything so we could analyze it. But the thing was, after that, it took us maybe 15 minutes to do the kind of analysis that took the King Games internal people about a week to do it. And they couldn't understand. Like, they didn't really understand how it happened, because someone would bring up a point, and then later that meeting, my team would say, well, the answer is this. And how can you do that? It takes a week to do that. And eventually, I think, they came to understand the value of reducing the marginal cost. Another place I've seen that is in randomized experiments. So I know a lot of firms do a lot of randomized experiments. And often, after you do a randomized experiment, it takes something like a person a week to get the data, to analyze the data, to make sense of it. And that raises the cost of randomized experiments dramatically. So one thing we did when we worked with the Smile Train, a nonprofit, was we actually put in a process and automated it so that it took something like a person hour, not a person week, to understand what the results were of an experiment. And so we actually made it so that every experiment, we could run infinite numbers of experiments and know the answers without having to have an infinite amount of manpower. Okay? And all of that just makes the data, it makes the data more useful for everyone. Okay. Related to that, again about the process of data, is that many firms that I've run into don't have a way of building up corporate knowledge of the findings. That the knowledge about the experiments that have been run or the data analysis reside within individuals. Okay, and it depends on who's in the room if you know what happened. And that's one thing that King Games did incredibly well, is King Games had a public document in which every time somebody knew something or discovered something, they put it into one big document which was archivable and searchable, and so everybody knew what the company knew. And it was incredibly valuable. It made the act of data analysis much better than if, you know, a key person leaves or isn't in the meeting and no one knows what the answers are. Okay, totally different is that I believe that the way to succeed with data in firms, and this will probably run counter to what the way many of you think about it, is the simpler the better. We worked with a big internet firm, and it's always has been my principle that I want to show the easiest, simplest, like big bar, little bar kinds of pictures to people who don't know that much about data. And often I go and I talk with the data people at different firms, and invariably they want to impress me. They say, what kind of Kalman filter do you like to apply when you do this and this? Like, I literally have no idea what they're talking about. And I say it. I say, I don't even know. I never even heard of those words. I'm not, you know, all I do is I basically try to look at the data and I try to describe it in the simplest possible way, because the answers are often in those simple data descriptions. And at this firm, which had a big, big data team, repeatedly the people at the top would say, I don't understand why we give you the same data we give our data team, and then you give us something that makes sense, and they give us stuff that is completely inscrutable. Okay? And in part, I think I do understand. I think it's because often the way that data people get their traction in firms is by doing stuff that's so hard that no one else can understand it, right? If other people can't understand it, that means you're valuable, right? That means that you can like control the agenda and people will listen to you. But I also found that when you do that, it's a very tenuous hold because you don't become integral to what happens. Okay, so what we did is we just always showed the easiest, simplest data in the world, okay? And people like that, okay? And another thing that we always made a point of doing, and this is going to sound kind of crazy, is we never interpret data, okay? We simply show the data, okay? Because what I found early on is whenever I interpreted data, people got mad, okay? Because maybe we didn't have all the background, we didn't interpret it well, or maybe it wasn't their idea. But if we could just show people the data, then everything changed, because then it could be the boss's idea how to interpret the data. Then it could be, you know, the people in marketing could do what they wanted. And so simply by showing data, unfiltered, it made all the difference, okay? And another thing we did that I thought was really interesting, which we never succeeded in doing systematically, is for a little while we had a deal where every meeting we went to, people would tell us the topic of the meeting ahead of time. And we then took it upon ourselves to always bring data to the meeting. Because regular corporate meetings have the same theme. There's some problem, okay? And you go around the room and everybody says, here's what I think the answer to the problem is, okay? And then the person with the most seniority says, I think the problem is this. The answer is this. And then everybody says, okay, how are we going to, let's do that. How are we going to do that? And you leave the meeting with marching orders. But no one's ever looked at the data. So what we would do is we would get news of what the meeting would be about a week ahead of time. And we would crunch the data. And so instead of going around the room and everybody saying what they thought the problem was, we would actually show the data. And in one particular case, it was a company, and the problem they had was that the people who were using their product, I think something like 20% of the people canceled, even though they were literally using the product up to the day that their year subscription expired, and they wouldn't renew their subscription. Okay, and everybody had their own pet idea about why that was, but we came with the data, and what we showed with the data is that about 2/3 of the people who were using the product up to the last day and didn't renew actually had tried to renew and their credit card had been turned down. Okay, but no one knew this in the organization. No one would have known it had we not brought the data, but as soon as we showed that, everyone's like, are you kidding me? We're turning down, 15% of our clients are their credit cards being turned down? And once they discovered that, they immediately did a randomized experiment where they would call up the people who got turned down and work out why it got turned down and get a different credit card, and then about 95% of those people stuck with the product. Okay? They had a perfect solution to their problem, but only because the data was there. And it wasn't hard analysis. It was simply a matter of having the data ahead of the meeting instead of being in the meeting and making a decision without the data being there at all. The last piece, and the one piece that we got really, really good at, okay, which I cannot recommend highly enough, is to simply, whenever possible, let everyone else take the credit. Okay? Look, if you're the data guys and you know what you're doing, and in the end, everybody knows that that's where the answers are coming from. But it's great if you let people who don't know anything about data pretend, right? Let them take the credit. I mean, that is part of corporate cultures. People are afraid, like everyone's afraid to say, I don't know, right? Everyone's got to be, every person in marketing's got to know what works and what doesn't work, okay? But we know that the data know better than most people, but who cares, okay? If you just let everybody else have the credit, everyone walks away happier. If there's one thing that we learned to be good at, it was to let anyone and everyone take credit for everything we did. Now, it was obvious in some sense because it's data-driven and no one had ever seen the kinds of analysis we were doing that we had kind of done it, but it didn't matter. As long as people could take credit for it, that was enough. Okay. So I got to say, if all of those things fail, there's one more secret weapon that I think is the most important piece of all, okay? And that is, if you do all that stuff with data and you still live in a world in which data is not king, in which your corporation, your company doesn't value the inputs of data, doesn't make decisions based on data, the answer is simple. You quit, okay? Because there's no point in wasting your time and your energy and your brilliant data analysis and data work on a set of people who don't appreciate it. There is a shortage, like you would not believe, as you all know, of good data talent in the world, okay? And if your company doesn't like it, the evidence says that people who quit are happier. So I advise you all, if you don't do anything else, quit.
Good. So I would add, having heard Levitt's distillation of what he learned from all that failure, which I found really interesting, I would add one more piece of advice if you're trying to turn your firm into a culture that, if it's, you have to realize that people who don't know data are primarily scared of data. It's not that they're, it's not that they're hostile to it, it's that it intimidates them. So I think something that Levitt and I have found works really, really well whenever you want to convey the meaning of the data is very, very simple. And we all know this, but we forget about it. And the simplest thing you can do is tell a story. And I think there are a couple primary reasons you want to tell a story. Number one is we're all narcissists, okay? So when you're hearing a story about something, what you inevitably do is cast yourself in the role of the person or people or group or institutions that are in the story. And you're constantly thinking, well, what decision would I have made there? I wouldn't have done that, or I would have thought to do this. So number one, stories appeal to the narcissist in all of us. And number two, look, let's be honest, stories make the numbers taste better. You know, they just do. So like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, the story really makes the data go down better. And by the way, it is true that sugar is to medicine what stories are to data. You know, like during the Dark Ages, sugar was very rare and very expensive, and its primary use was in medicine because it was the strongest, sweetest thing that was available, even though it was very expensive. And the reason they needed it in medicine was because most medicine of that age was made of things like animal feces and decayed bark. Okay, which, by the way, didn't work as medicine very well. The good news is it got the sugar industry off and running, which was really helpful. But so for those reasons, stories are incredibly important. So let's say that you are trying to persuade someone of a theory, right? Theories are where it's really at. Ideas and theories are the important part, but to sell people on them can be hard. If you explain the theory to them, most people won't get it. So let's say that I want to illustrate to you guys a theory about you know, the difference between what economists call declared and revealed preferences, right? Does that sound interesting to you? Maybe, probably not. But then let's say I kind of try to find a way to tell a story about it. So then I might say to you, well, let's do a little survey right here. Let me see, raise your hand if you, after you use a public bathroom, you do not wash your hands. Okay? Hoist them high. Let's see what we got here. All right, I got about 2,000 people and I see 0 hands. So Levitt, that would be 0% then? Yeah. Okay, he's the math guy. Okay, so so here's the thing. You're a relatively honest group of people, I gather, because you're by proxy, I gather that, because you're successful enough in your job to be at a conference like this, and to be successful in a job in modern America means that you're typically pretty honest. We do punish dishonesty. So I'm going to assume you're pretty honest. You look to be fairly hygienic, from what I can tell, but I also know that about 30% of you, particularly the men, are lying to me, okay? And I know you're lying because we have data on this. It's called public restroom hand hygiene compliance data. And you say, well, how do you get those data? I'll tell you how I get those data. I travel a lot. I'm guessing many of you do as well. Whenever I get off an airplane, if I need to use a restroom, I go, do so, and then wash my hands. And then at the sink, I'll just kind of linger for a while at the sink. I always carry a handy-dandy notebook. I would suggest you do the same. And while you're lingering at the sink, you're just writing down the number of people men, I haven't tried it in the ladies' room yet, the number of people who have come out of a stall or a urinal, and the share of them that are washing their hands and those that aren't. And I can tell you, those data that I've gathered conform with similarly collected data, which argues that about 70% of the men, after they use a public restroom, will wash their hands and 30% don't, okay? So this little story illustrates what we would call the difference between declared preferences, what people say they do, how they say they will behave, how they say they will invest or vote, whatever, right? And revealed preferences, which is what people actually do, the real behavior. Now, if you care at all about your work or your policy or your government or your family, you need to know what is really happening, not what people say is happening. That's why the idea of declared versus revealed preferences is important, but to get that idea home can be hard because it sounds kind of, maybe abstruse to some people or a little preachy. So you try to find a way to bake it into a story. So what kind of story? Well, let's think about a realm in which the difference between declared and revealed preferences is hugely important, and that would be money. How we think about and spend and do everything there is to do with money. Buying versus saving versus investing, stealing versus giving it away. There are so many activities around money. And you would think that economists like Levitt and his whole fraternity would know everything there is to know about how people feel about and behave with money. The fact is they know almost nothing. Why do they know almost nothing? Because, well, we haven't had really good data until quite recently, and even a lot of that data is very privacy protected. And here's the big problem. If you just ask people how they spend or save or invest, they will tell you one thing, but then when you can get hold of some data that reveals the reality, you'll see they do something totally different. So if you want to kind of get in there and really, really, really understand, what can you do? How can you bridge that gap between the declared and the revealed preferences when it comes to how people spend money? So here's one idea that a young economist named Keith Chen had. And his idea was, what if I could set up an experimental economy where I could watch every single dollar and see how it's spent over months and months and run all kinds of experiments and write up all these kinds of papers to really build a model to show how people really behave toward money. He thought about that for a little while, but he was smart enough to then realize, well, almost every experiment, university settings, professional settings, whatever, governments, almost every experiment where you've got people being put in a situation where it's obvious that their behavior is being judged, people respond knowing that they're under scrutiny. And so they don't behave as they would naturally. So if I want to do an experiment that tests for altruism, people are really altruistic in a lab setting. In the real world, much, much less so, because scrutiny is this huge lever pressing down on our behavior. So Keith Chen was thinking, what if I could set up an experimental economy to look at how we think about money, but because humans say one thing and do another, he thought, what if I leave the humans out of it and instead set up an experimental economy with monkeys, right? Because monkeys are kind of like us, and they have hands, and I can give them money, and I can set up like a store where they can buy food and steal food. And he thought, wouldn't that be awesome if I could set up an experimental monkey economy and then just write down everything that happened and write a bunch of papers and maybe win tenure. Keith Chen was an untenured professor at Yale at the time this story begins. So he thought it was a pretty good idea, but he was also smart enough that when his elders would ask him, he just showed up at Yale, they'd ask him, Keith, what are you going to be working on here? What's your research project? And he would say, well, I'm going to be doing some currency experiments. He'd never say the word monkey, because, economists don't do monkey experiments. But he thought that this could really work. He'd actually, by coincidence, worked with monkeys before in a lab at Harvard before he got to Yale with a psychologist. But now as an economist, he thought this could really work. So this was his dream. And he set up a monkey lab at Yale New Haven Hospital. So for those of you who have not set up a monkey lab, here's how it works. You take a big cage, which is basically about from here, maybe about to the end of this stage that I'm on, about down to about here, okay? And this is what's called the communal cage, and 7 monkeys would live there. And then down at the end of this cage, there's a little door in the big cage where 1 monkey at a time could go into a much smaller cage right here, and this is called the experimental cage. And that is where the money experimenting would happen. This is not what he wanted originally. Originally what he wanted was just to have a big cage with a bunch of monkeys and money, teach them how to use money, and then just let them go crazy with the money in the cage and see if they were like exchanging it with each other. But the people who had to give him permission to run the experiment, they would not allow that. They argued that giving the monkeys money just in a free-for-all would change and pollute the monkeys' natural culture, and that would be bad for the monkeys as research subjects, okay? So think of that what you will. Just as a note of comparison, literally on the other side of this wall where this big monkey cage was another monkey lab at Yale New Haven Hospital where researchers would breed monkeys and get them just old enough to give them experimental brain surgery, after which they would die, okay? So the lesson from the overseers of the experiment was that it is okay to raise a monkey and kill it for medical research, but you cannot give a monkey money because that's really dangerous, okay? So that was the limitation that he had to accept, but he accepted it. It was a compromise. So basically, all the money had to be in the big cage. Sorry, the monkeys lived in the big cage, but all the money could only be handled here in the little cage by 1 monkey at a time. 7 monkeys, as I mentioned. He chose the capuchin monkey. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the capuchin, but they're awesome little guys. They're like the size of like a very scrawny 1-year-old child with a tail the length of the body. And they're very sweet. They're dumb as a doorknob, which is exactly, so they're not a smart monkey at all. They're not, nothing like a chimpanzee, nothing like language. But by the way, that's exactly why he wanted to work with them. He didn't want to see how a smart monkey could figure out its way around money and then start to deceive the experimenters like humans would. He wants to see what the brain is hardwired to do on these tiny-brained capuchin monkeys. And if there are any parallels between their activity with money and ours, then he thought he could get a lot of papers out of it. Now, the other things to note, that all the monkeys were named for characters in James Bond films. It's just something they do in monkey labs. So there was like a 007 monkey and a Goldfinger monkey. And the one that became Keith Chen's favorite was named Felix, after Felix Leiter, the CIA agent. And the things to know about the capuchin is they are sugar fiends, okay? So if you brought like a capuchin in here up onto the stage with a vat of something really sweet, like marshmallow fluff, the monkey would jump up onto the edge of the vat and eat like its body weight in fluff. And it would stagger off into the corner, or maybe over to Levitt there, and it would just puke all over his shoes, okay? But here's the beautiful part. Then the monkey would stagger back to the vat and start eating again, which if you're an economist makes them an excellent research subject, okay? They're gonna want a lot of what you have. The other thing, as I mentioned about the capuchin, very small and very rudimentary brain, and they're not even really thought to think the way we conceive of thinking. If they were thought to think, it would be about just one of two things. One, I mentioned sweet food, and the other, sex, okay? Which doesn't make them all that different from a lot of people that you and I both know, okay? And now Keith Chen wants to teach them the third important component of human life, which is money. So how do you teach a bunch of tiny-brained, food and sex-crazed monkeys to use money? Here's the way it works. You bring them in one at a time. Like I said, Felix would come in here, and you'd give Felix a coin. They used washers from a hardware store. Felix would take the coin, sniff it, try to eat it. And when he'd see that it's not edible, or that he couldn't have sex with it, he'd throw it at you. And if you did it repeatedly, he'd get really mad. And we all know what mad monkeys start to throw at you after, so you don't get them too mad. So what you do is you give them the coin, and then you offer some sweet food. They used grapes and apple slices and Jell-O cubes, all different kinds of food that they were going to set up in the experiment. And then Felix would grab the food and eat it, then you would take the coin out of its other hand. Now, like I said, the monkey's not very smart. It took, on average, 6 months for the 7 monkeys to learn that if you give a coin, you get food in return. But they did learn that after time, okay? So now Keith Chen's got the monkeys having learned that money will get them something of value in this little cage down here. And now he can run some experiments to understand if there are parallels between them and us. First one he does is very simple, very elegant, very useful. Take all these different foods with all these 7 different monkeys, and they're running these experiments hundreds of times each on each monkey. And what they want to do is he wants to see, do individual monkeys have the ability to consistently express their preferences with money? Because that's what humans do, right? Like, you may say you're altruistic. I don't know unless I can see what you actually do with your money. You may say you're cultured, that you love the opera, or you love going to museums. But if I can see how you spend every penny and every minute, I'll know. Humans are very consistent about expressing our truest preferences with money, and he wants to see if monkeys have that ability at all. So the way he does this experiment, when a monkey would come into the little cage, he'd have a researcher standing on either side of the monkey with different foods. And they're all the same price, and he wants to see, over time, do the monkeys, even though they're so stupid, have the ability to choose any one consistently? And he was thinking, probably not, but if they did, that would be great for him, right? The parallel would be useful for him. And as it turns out, they did. So Felix, for instance, loved Jell-O cubes. Whenever there was Jell-O available, he would always buy that. And the other monkeys, similarly, some liked apples, some liked grapes, and so on. Now, if there was no Jell-O available that day, Felix would still buy the other food because he's a monkey and it's food, and it's not like they're working for the money either. They're being given the money, plus which he doesn't have a pocket or a wallet to save the money, thinking I'll wait till the Jell-O comes out, okay? But all the monkeys had this consistent preference, and so Keith Chen is thinking, this is awesome. They're just like us in that regard. Now, however, he wants to test to see how a monkey responds to price shocks and wealth shocks. Because we know that humans When something gets more expensive, we consume less of it, all else equal, right? So what he does now, which is a little bit mean, he takes every monkey knowing which food they like most and doubles the price of just that food overnight. So now Felix comes in. Felix is used to giving 1 coin and getting a bowl with 2 cubes of Jell-O, or 1 coin and 2 grapes. Now all of a sudden, he gives a coin and gets 1 cube of Jell-O, but 2 cubes of grapes, 2 apple slices, and so on. The price of Jell-O has doubled. And so Keith Chen is hoping and praying that the monkeys will change their behavior in response to the price shocks and later the wealth shocks, but he's thinking probably not, because people don't even always do that in these tiny brain monkeys. But as it turns out, they did. It's like after just a very short time, Felix realized that the Jell-O had gotten so much more expensive relatively, and he started buying more of the other food. And now Keith Chen is saying, God bless me, this is fantastic. I mean, because of the parallels between them and us, the papers he's going to get out of this are going to be fantastic. And if he ever needed further evidence of the parallels between the monkeys and us, or us and them, depending on how you want to look at it, he got it one day in the lab when something just totally bizarre happened that no one could have ever predicted. It was a day just like any other. All the monkeys are up here hanging around, and Felix comes in to start the experiments for the day, and by now they would usually give each monkey a little basket with 12 coins in it. And the monkey would gather up the coins and wait for the researchers to come in and start to buy food. But on this day, for whatever reason, instead of taking all the coins in its hands, Felix takes the basket of 12 coins and flings them in here into the big cage where all the other monkeys are. Then he runs in after it. So it's like a bank heist over here followed by a jailbreak into the big cage, okay? And now just imagine what's going on in the big cage. 7 monkeys, 12 coins on the floor, and the monkeys have learned by now that the coins have value, so they go after the coins, and they're scrounging for them, they're fighting for them. And Keith Chen sees it, and he says, holy crap, I got to get in there and get the money out right away, because they'll shut my experiment down, because I can't have money in there. So he goes in there to get the money back from the monkeys, and the monkeys, of course, won't give him the money back because they've learned that the money has value. So he goes and gets a bunch of big buckets of the food to bribe the monkeys, and now the monkeys are thinking, oh, whenever possible, we should steal this man's money, because you know, now, like the exchange rate is like they're getting a handful of grapes just for giving back 1 coin, right? And then out of the corner of his eye, Keith Chen sees one monkey who's still got a coin, like hops over and just gives it to another monkey. And the economist now is thinking, wow, you know, what's going on there? Is this monkey altruism I'm seeing? Maybe it's the repayment of a monkey loan that I hadn't, you know, caught sight of? It was neither of those. A couple seconds of grooming, and then bam, it was monkey sex. It was the first recorded instance of monkey prostitution in the history of science, okay? I mean, talk about expressing your preferences with money, okay? And then after the sex is over, which is like 8 seconds because they're capuchin monkeys, after the sex is over, the monkey who'd gotten the coin for sex hops over and gives it to Keith Chen to get a big handful of grapes. I'm sure if there'd been a cigarette machine in the cage, it would have gone. So I tried to warn you. That's how I spend my days. But that concludes whatever just happened here. We thank you so much for having both of us. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you so much. Okay.
All right. So that was an amazing keynote. Glad you liked it, yes? Yeah, really amazing. So thank you, Freakonomics guys, Stevens. I'm not sure what is the best choice of words, was amazing. I think they spoiled Thanksgiving for me with that whole turkey thing. Anyway, you know, I hope you all enjoyed this keynote, the conference overall, sessions, power hour, ask the experts, all those nice things that we had. Unfortunately, all good things come to an end. And so this is the end of the second Data Insight Summit. You know, it was just truly amazing to have all of you here. And I think it's really hard to put into words how much it means that you all came over here, flew in many cases, maybe you're local in some cases, spending your time with us. And really, I can't thank you enough for being here and what you do. It is the community of all you users that make Power BI the product it is. And you guys really are the heart of this community. So really from the bottom of my heart and the bottom of everyone of Microsoft here's heart, thank you, thank you, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for making this conference what it is. Thank you for driving us. And thank you for keeping us honest and making the product what it is. And so with that, I guess one final shout out to the crew and the people who have kept this conference humming. And thanks again. Hope to see you next year. Goodbye.